Hey, it's Mike here, and today we're going to be responding to Dr. Peter Attia's video on whether or not red meat causes cancer. As many of you know, there's processed meat as a class 1A carcinogen according to the WHO, and then class 2A for red meat. And Dr. Peter Attia, I said PETA, but it reminds me of Family Guy.
That's a great idea, Brian. Maybe you could join PETA.
Join me for what?
No, PETA, the organization. PETA is an acronym, PETA.
No, I'm not. I'm Catholic.
And Dr. Peter Attia, super well-selling, best-selling author for his Outlive book on longevity. Many of you have asked me to comment about him. I've almost commented about him in the past, especially because he sort of puts exercise way ahead of dietary changes and even says that he wants to stay out of the sort of tribal dietary stuff. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is the interview that many of you have asked me to respond to. I don't know who this guy is asking him questions, but this is going to be one of my classic V actions. I'm just going to do a raw reaction and then, of course, add stuff that needs to be added later. So a mix of, and also, I got a new microphone. Hopefully it sounds good. I even taped my little logo on there. So let's see how that goes.
And so if you had to look at that statement, let's say just red meat gives you cancer, where would you rank that in our ranking system today?
So this is going to sound bold, but I would actually put this in the nonsense category.
Okay, right off the bat, he's putting this in the nonsense category. So the WHO's team of scientists that reviewed all of the studies on the topic. They're just wrong. Peter Attia's right. Let's see what his argument is.
Which is not to say that a dietary pattern high in red meat could not play a role in the development of cancer. But that's very different than the question. So if the question is, does red meat cause cancer? I think that is not correct. And I think there's plenty of evidence that that is not correct. If the question is, do people...
Okay, distinction that needs to be made. He's saying there's plenty of evidence that that's not correct. It is worth mentioning, there is a high level of evidence that needs to be presented to prove that something is causal, and that's why they left it at probable carcinogen. Some other things in that category are like hydrazine, lead, DDT, and some other things that, might need a little bit more data, but it's also the case that you need just as strong of evidence to say that something does not cause something as you do to say that it does cause it. So my guess is he's not going to present all of that in this, sort of off-the-cuff interview, but let's see.
People who eat a lot of red meat, or do people who eat a lot of processed red meat have a higher risk of getting cancer? I think the answer to that question is yes, but it's probably less because of the meat, although in the case of certain processing, it may be the case. But it's probably much more because of what they're not eating. It's probably much more because their diets tend to be much lower in vegetables. And
at least he likes vegetables still. That's why I actually haven't responded to him as soon as I should have, because there's so many carnivore crazy people out there that just need to be responded to first. But I was like, I might as well.
Specifically much lower in insoluble fiber, which plays a very important role in the prevention of colorectal cancer.
But why does it? And this is where, you could argue we have studies showing that chlorophyll might offset the negative effects of heme iron. However, that's sort of like saying, just because chlorophyll might offset some of the carcinogenic nature of smoking, just antioxidants in your bloodstream, for example. Therefore, smoking doesn't cause cancer. Obviously, that's a more extreme example, but I don't see how his logic of this dietary pattern where, there's probably this carcinogen here, but, if you eat enough vegetables, you're okay. Although I guess he's saying, it's actually the positive effect of these other foods. Well, then I would ask him, why is red meat sticking out of the pack here? And perhaps this is a good time to hit this quite recent 2023 study. I have not mentioned this study yet, but it's a massive, interesting one, and it mentions the WHO's status of probable, and that as the motivation for actually doing this research, saying, they asked for more data, let's get more data. They say, in the past we've had studies that are 100,000 people, and then they got up to 500,000 people, then to millions, and in this study, looking at 150 countries, they're more or less covering billions. And the result is that unprocessed red meat consumption is quite highly correlated with overall all cancers. And they did a bunch of interesting things here. That correlation was up around an R of 0.8, which is highly correlated. But we can look at this chart here, and it is the case that, a correlation value over 0.5, in my opinion, very notable. The higher up you get, even more concerning. And yeah, 11 cancers were over that threshold. We have skin and multiple myelomas heavily correlated at the top, and being actually marked as previously unexplored for that connection. Then we have leukemia, as well as breast and prostate cancer actually beating out colorectal cancer, followed by testicular lymphoma and other concerning cancers as well. They also noted something really interesting that they say contributes to the causality. They say that there seems to be a pretty distinct, roughly 18-year lag between increases or decreases in red meat consumption and then the corresponding increase or decrease in colorectal cancer. This is across several countries, and they say that this is a strong reason to support causality here. But let's let them get back into it.
The debate on red meat and cancer goes back for long periods of time. And again, it suffers from all of the usual trappings of nutritional epidemiology, which is why John Ioannidis famously said that all nutritional epidemiology belongs in the wastebasket.
Yeah, we're just going to throw out all nutritional epidemiology. In fact, let's just go straight back to anecdotes. I think that would be great.
The two most obvious problems with nutritional epidemiology in this regard are that it's very difficult to get an accurate reflection of what people consume using food frequency questionnaires. It's almost impossible.
Questionnaire? I know he knows what a questionnaire is, but it makes me think of like a musketeer that's asking you questions. We are the 3 questionnaires. Fill out this form or sword play. But yeah, we have meta-analyses like these showing food frequency questionnaires are reliable, especially under 1 year. And at this point, I should mention that this video is sponsored by Seeds DS01, a daily symbiotic, a prebiotic, and a probiotic that has 53.6 billion active bacterial cell units from 24 different strains, which are scientifically shown to support various areas of health, like gut barrier, gut immunity, digestive health, heart health, skin health, and more. And I wanted to focus really quickly on, whether probiotics even work. Does seed even work? And it was the case that some older studies were not showing amazing results with probiotics, and I even covered that, but it's definitely the case, as we've covered, many strains in seed have randomized controlled trials, high quality science showing improvements, whether it is eczema, immune function, digestive health like constipation, that is there. And then I also think seed is more legit than a lot of other ones because it has that really effective outer coating that is meant to survive your stomach acid, and they've done digestive simulations to show that it does. Lindy and I have been taking these for 3 years now and loving it. So if you would like to try CSDS01 Daily Symbiotic, of course, click the link below and use the code MIC25, MIC25 for 25% off your first month's supply. All right.
And secondly, and I think more seriously, it's very difficult to disentangle the variable of interest from the other lifestyle variables that are covariates within the problem, what we refer to as the healthy user bias. So I don't dispute for one moment that every time you do an epidemiologic survey and you compare people who live on hot dogs and pepperoni to vegetarians, the epidemiology will always tell you that the vegetarians are going to live longer.
And is he going to say that's because they're vegetarian? Well, he did support vegetable and fiber consumption earlier.
And while that might be an extreme example, you do appreciate that on average, those vegetarians have a much higher socioeconomic status. They are much more health conscious. They are exercising much more. They are much less likely to be smoking, doing yoga, all these other things. And they're...
Yeah, this is what has been brought up a lot. Yeah, that healthy user bias. Again, it's probably like the 5th time I've heard it, and it can be used to essentially just dismiss anything in which we're getting a positive result for a food or a practice. And this is a good opportunity to plug Dr. Matthew Nagra, who also responded to him.
We still see associations between unprocessed red meat consumption and colorectal cancer. And in some studies like the UK Biobank, those who eat more red meat are actually of higher socioeconomic status, yet still have higher risk.
And going back to that study, actually, from this chart here, on the left, of course, we just have that cancer rate and red meat consumption. But then on the right, you can see the bigger circles means higher socioeconomic status. And yeah, as we've known, red meat is associated with an increased higher socioeconomic status because it's an expensive food. In developing nations, it's considered a luxury, etc. And so I don't know where he's going with that. Yeah, it probably is the case that there are certain habits that people that are vegan or vegetarian have that are better, but we adjust for that, and in many times I've explained that we over-adjust for that crap. For example, taking things that are causally linked to the diet, like BMI being lower because of higher fiber and higher water consumption in food, leading to lower caloric intake. We have randomized trials showing it lowers BMI, yet we end up adjusting for that and lessening the effect, which is really frustrating. So, this can go either way here, but he's acting like, oh, red meat is just fine. In the case of red meat, it's only confounding factors. It's only other things and habits that could also be skewing the results, which is frustrating. And where I have to just straight up call him out for one of the things that I know about him and his habits, that multiple sources show that he's eating between 6 and 10 processed deer jerky sticks per day, which a quick calculation shows is like 3,000 milligrams of sodium per day. And of course, this is a processed meat. So he's arguing here for red meat not causing cancer. Well, he's slamming down a processed meat, and he'd probably be like, oh, well, it's a healthier processed meat, natural flavors, blurdy blur. It's still a processed meat. It still falls into that category. And it is also worth mentioning that he is an investor in that venison company, so he also has not just the motivation to eat those and talk about eating those, but also to talk about how meat is healthier for you than it might actually be. And one Redditor mentioned that he's eating like $900 a month worth of this deer venison, which is wild. But yeah, veganism is expensive though. And I should also mention, as far as that sodium goes, he talks about the dangers of sodium, even on his website, high sodium intake and inflammation and kidney risk and the actual danger of it during aging. Because remember, this is a longevity guy. He's trying to get you to age as gracefully as possible and live long and stuff. But he even talks about the risks of sodium. And of course, to the American Heart Association, I might as well just double down on it. Quote, the science behind sodium reduction is clear. Significant evidence links excess sodium intake with high blood pressure, increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and heart failure. And to Business Insider, one of the articles that covered this, they're saying he's trying to get a high protein intake to keep his muscle mass on because that's associated with, healthier aging. So he's slamming down like 100 grams of protein from these processed meat sticks, which, again, actually class 1A carcinogen in order to live longer. So I don't know how his logic around diet works out. It's really strange. And I think that he has some weird bro science-y dietary takes, but he kind of takes this angle of being agnostic or neutral on diet and then pushing exercise, which I think is really marketable, and clearly it's marketable because it's gotten him to the top of the charts on his book. And final point here, I would say though, I am a big proponent of keeping muscle on through aging, and I am going to do a video on that in a vegan context as well. So stay tuned for that. Let's get back to what he's saying though.
So, when you look at the most compelling case for people who eat the highest amount of meat and their risk of cancer, there was a study that was done in Europe that looked at nearly 500,000 people, and it divided them into a cohort that were eating more than 160 grams per day of protein from red meat and processed meat, and it compared them to people that were eating virtually none, 20 grams per day. So again, I like when they do this because you're at least taking like the most extremes. And indeed, there was a difference, but it was relatively small, right? So even under that setting, it was the difference between a 1.7 increase in the risk of cancer versus a 1.3 percent risk, absolute risk for colorectal cancer over the period of study. So
still a 40% increase of getting one of our leading killing cancers, still notable. And I had to find the study. Here it is. He seems to even be defending processed meats here, but the conclusion is literally in this population, a reduction of processed meat consumption to less than 20 grams a day would prevent more than 3% of all deaths. That's the study he used to support his claim. It's not just epidemiological studies that we have creating a connection here. There's a reason that we got red meat into the causal category for WHO, and that is because we have studies on the mechanisms. We have things in there such as heme iron, which oxidizes from this study, that oxidative stress involved in lipid peroxidization or fat oxidization, a complex process which finally causes the formation of cytotoxic and genotoxic aldehydes. And these aldehydes are able to promote cancer progression as reported by epidemiological and experimental studies. Oh, experimental studies. Oh, we have those. I forgot. And then we also have NEU5GC, which I would say needs more research, but it's at least another reason. For example, from Science Daily, leads to an inflammatory immune response that could increase tumor formation. And it's at the point where scientists are experimenting with ways to lower NEU5GC in the case of this one by electrically shocking it, pointing to red meat-induced colorectal cancer possibly being NEU5GC induced. And then also that the human intake of NEU5GC can cause these antibodies in the body that change the intestinal flora, thus promoting chronic inflammation and tumors.
And again, that's assuming that you arrived at this through randomization, which you didn't. So again, there was another step.
And that's where, it'd be nice to have randomized control trials for everything, but we can't randomize control trial massive populations of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. So we do the best that we can and have this thing called epidemiology, which I don't know why certain people are just like, oh, let's poo-poo on that and throw it all away, unless it's some category that we like exercise.
Study that was done, it was a 10-year observational study that looked at about 150,000 people with the highest tertile of red meat consumption. And, they had a 50% increase in absolute risk, in relative risk to those in the lowest tertile. Again,
you're still just proving the point that the epidemiology is matching the mechanisms.
I could, the error bar on this study was so big that it barely made statistical significance despite the sample size there, which I think, again, just speaks to the heterogeneity.
Barely making statistical significance. If something makes statistical significance, it's statistically significant. It means it's very unlikely that the finding is due to chance. Yeah, we could always do better, which, again, look at the p-values in the study I showed you earlier. Freaking 0.000. So he's just, being ridiculous. And this is where, again, it's statistics where if you look around and actually look at the rates per 100,000 of cancers, it will look pretty low, but we're still talking about our leading cancers. And this was, again, that whole relative risk versus absolute risk thing that all these meat proponents came out in support of processed meat, saying it's not actually that big of a deal that processed meat causes cancer because it's not going to automatically kill you. And only 15% of people that smoke cigarettes are going to die from lung cancer. So that's not a reason to smoke. And this is just bad public health logic, if I do say so.
Of this. Net, I would say that every one of these studies basically ends up having the same issue with it, which is when you look at the details, you realize it is very difficult to come up with a meaningful view that it's red meat specifically that is driving cancer, as opposed to the absence of vegetables, the absence of fiber, or maybe the
And again, going back to that study I mentioned, we're seeing other foods not being associated here. I'll say it, even chicken not being associated. Yet people eating fried chicken and all that crap, which would be associated with all of the same negative habits, likely because it doesn't have heme iron in it, is not going to have as much of a cancer signal, and in some cases won't be picked up. Obviously, I think it has other negative health effects as somebody who eats a fully plant-based diet, but still not supporting his point. And we're also getting toward the end of this, and I still have yet to see him make that argument for why red meat does not cause cancer. Say, okay, experimentally, these are the components of red meat that aren't causing cancer. And then here is the epidemiology and everything and all the Bradford Hill criteria and stuff of why it doesn't cause cancer. He's not saying that. He's not even saying, oh, we don't really know for sure, it seems, but he's confident that it doesn't somehow.
The absence of fiber, or maybe the presence of some of the ultra processing things that go into consuming certain patterns of meat, like, gas station bought jerky and stuff like that.
But we're talking about red unprocessed meat here, still having an increased risk.
So, we could talk.
And he's the jerky king, bro. Come
a
on.
lot more about this, but I really think that the ill health effects for red meat consumption is incredibly weak. The hazard ratios themselves for this are very, very small, even with all of the limitations that I've mentioned. And so, therefore, if you go back to kind of the Austin Bradford Hill criteria of epidemiology.
Oh, he's hitting the Bradford. Let's see what he says.
Which, I outline in great detail in the book. Very hard to imagine that there is causality here. In fact, the epidemiology here is so underwhelming that it almost draws the opposite conclusion, that it's almost hard to believe there is a signal given how underwhelming the epidemiology is. Whereas conversely,
again, remember from the epidemiology of that 18-year lag, that was quite distinct in that last study, also supporting causality.
When you look at the epidemiology of smoking or the epidemiology of...
Yeah, taking the most powerful carcinogen that we're exposed to, essentially, is not the baseline for anything causing cancer, or not.
Exercise, like those are
here he goes up, so he's hitting the exercise.
That it factors into what we see as the overall causality narrative.
Now, we'll get back to causality in a second, but because he mentioned the exercise, and I previously mentioned that he's puts exercise so far ahead of diet in a previous video, that I just had to quickly mention a couple studies here. We can compare them. We have this study out of the UK looking at UK Biobank data saying that shifting your diet to a healthier one could get you 10 more years of life, and these healthy changes are things like more whole grains and less processed meat. And then we also have this study on exercising, looking at 13 studies for regular physical exercise, and that only bought people between 0.4 and 6.9 years of increased life expectancy. So he happens to love the epidemiology for exercise, but throws it away for dietary changes. And then we also have, back to that diet study, this table, which goes ahead and shows, it is that red unprocessed meat as well that is contributing to increased all-cause mortality, because this is an all-cause mortality table, yet plant-based products across the board, unless they're refined sodas, are showing decreased mortality and decreased mortality trends. But I'll just go ahead and look at some Bradford Hill criteria and just really quickly get an idea. Is there no real argument here for causality? Was the WHO just clinically insane? Well, here we have biological gradient where, greater exposure generally leads to higher incidence of effect. We're seeing that across a bunch of other studies, which is, again, consistency / reproducibility. We're seeing study after study after study, increased red meat consumption, increased colorectal cancer, and now as well as other cancers. Analogy of the effect of similar factors. A similar factor would be, and for analogy, processed meat would be a similar factor here. And he seems to start conflating processed and red meat in general here, but I should also say you have heterocyclic amines in cigarettes, and that's a carcinogenic component of that. Good analogy. Then he gets to strength or effect size. He's saying that this is the weak point, but it even says right here, a small association does not mean that there is not a causal effect. Though, of course, a larger is better for a causal argument, especially when, for example, if there's a 10% increase in heart disease that was truly caused by something, that would still be 50,000 more deaths a year in the US. It's does it matter? Yes, it does matter, even at that small amount. Anyway, we have plausibility with mechanism. We've shown several mechanisms in experimental studies like that. Heme iron, for example, the heterocyclic amines, which is, again, experimental evidence and coherence. Yes, the lab findings match the epidemiology and temporality. As I mentioned from that study previously, we see that, yes, there's an 18-year delay between exposure to red meat and cancers. And then it's also the case in the experimental stuff where animals or whatever are exposed to heme iron, and you get that oxidation and you get that DNA damage. And then finally, we have specificity, another one that he's criticizing. He's saying that, it could be something else. Is there likely another explanation? And then my response to that was, hey, if you're looking at these other foods that also fit those dietary patterns, like chicken, for example, we are not seeing it, but it's, again, those ingredients that we've seen it mechanistically, experimentally, showing oxidative damage to DNA. Let's let him finish up last 10 seconds. Oh, Those are the last 10 seconds. Yeah, anyway, so in the end, it's very clear that I do not agree with this guy. And I think that this is sort of a part of a bigger pattern with him and diet here. I, again, appreciate that he's not clinically insane on diet and is like, plants are trying to kill you, like a lot of people are. Thankfully, as I've recently covered, a lot of carnivore diet people are quitting or adding plants back in to certain degrees. And I think his view, just totally favoring exercise over, dietary epidemiology, for example, is not legit. And he also didn't like debunk any experimental studies talking about heme. He didn't even mention heme iron, which is like the main topic here in terms of what is claimed to be a causal factor. And he's also literally sucking down like 6 to 10 processed meat sticks per day, of course, from the company that he invests in, which is a meat company, and again makes you wonder how legitimate his views are here. You could say the same thing, I'm a vegan and so I support various vegan products, but in this case it's like a major carcinogen question. He's landing on a certain side of it. He's selling literally that product. So that's worth knowing, or I should say he's investing in a product that's being sold. I still think, if in the end he gets more people to exercise, his net result is probably good, but I'm still gonna say when I disagree with him on something, and I clearly do here, the research that I showed you does not match up to what he's saying. I still think there's strong Bradford Hill criteria for this. Yeah, if it was even clear cut, 2 times relative risk in all situations, then that'd be nice in terms of how certain we are here. But with how many studies we have that are consistent here, I think it's a pretty strong argument. And still a 20 or 30% increased risk consistently for leading cancers. And now we're finding more cancers connected, whether it's myeloma, testicular cancer, etc. As we saw from that list. Like, this could just be the beginning. Anyway, let me know down below what you think about all this. And of course, if you would like to try Seeds DS01 Daily Symbiotic, click the link below and use that code Mike25 at checkout. And also stay tuned for that vegan muscle aging video so we can get, I actually almost, it's like distorting my arm and making me almost look off here. And thanks for watching, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. And my new little microphone, I even put my little logo on it. So sassy.
Somebody's having a rally for me now?
No, for Peter.
That's me. I'm Peter.